everyone. Thanks for having us. I think our presentation is going to dovetail really nicely to what we just heard from the Salesforce lead. We're going to talk a little bit more about the practicalities and how to work as a team with all the variety of stakeholders that you need to partner with. I'm coming from a legal background. My colleague Alec is coming from the business and technical side. And we found that a collaboration among various stakeholders really helps in terms of getting things off the ground and also being able to get executive support. So we did that. So just to level set, I mean, we're all here. We all know what ethics definition is, but just to make sure that we're talking about not just AI/ML, right? Because this conference is about AI/ML, but data ethics is actually potentially a broader concept. And I think one of the best practices, tips and tricks we might give to all of you here today is to really think about the scope of your data ethics program at the company. So what kinds of data are you going to be attaching a data ethics program to? Is it just going to be the AI/ML projects, or is it going to be a broader set of data? Are you going to be looking at how you're treating customer and employee data, regardless of whether you're approaching it from an AI/ML technological sort of algorithmic output, or are you thinking about it in a broader sense? And I think that helps kind of orient the way that you're going to be thinking about principles, policies, governance, the program, the resources that you're going to need to put into practice to get something like this off the ground. So from a legal perspective, right now we're all putting these data ethics programs in place because it's the right thing to do and because customers are asking for it and because we believe that there's benefit in putting these kinds of programs in place. But regulation is coming out of Europe and in the United States and elsewhere around the world. So from a legal perspective, another best practice approach that you can take is make sure that you're engaging the legal team at your company, because honestly, they're going to be tracking these things. It's going to be on their radar, and it's going to be a legal obligation to be doing these AI assessments, to be tracking programmatically what you're doing with data to ensure that you're treating data responsibly. And the lawyers are actually going to be good collaborators and great advocates to help you develop a program, because they're going to have an understanding based on the programs they've already developed for privacy and security. Over the past several years, there's been legal requirements related to personal data coming out of Europe with GDPR, in California with CCPA. So we have programs in place and we have an understanding of how to translate legal requirements into programmatic, operational types of programs that are actually going to be effective within a company. So don't be scared of the lawyers at your company. Reach out to them and please ask them for help with developing your data ethics program, because I do think they're going to have some really good ideas, as well as your public policy and government affairs team, because they're going to have an understanding of kind of the legislative history, the legislative intent behind some of these things, and they're going to be able to find resources for you with industry associations in terms of practical insights and benchmarking and ways to collaborate with peers that are going to help you in terms of how you develop your program. So ethics and data protection programs, and Alec, feel free to chime in on this slide because I think this is kind of the transition between legal and the program. So privacy and ethics. So as I mentioned, in most companies now, we have privacy programs. You see privacy statements, you see privacy impact assessments, and a whole kind of industry that's been established around personal data and compliance with privacy laws globally. There's a lot of commonalities between privacy and ethics. They're both contextual. They're both about people. They're both talking about treating data responsibly. There's a lot of information and case law in the GDPR that's related about privacy being a human right. Isn't that what we're talking about here with responsible use of data and ethical treatment when we're talking about AI and personal data? So if you think about it conceptually, there's a lot of commonalities between privacy and ethics that I think are really helpful to have in the back of your mind as you're reaching out to stakeholders and trying to get your program off the ground. And then incorporating ethics into your privacy and security programs. I think here, this is really important in terms of leveraging resources and bandwidth and stakeholder involvement and that sort of executive support for an ethics program. Because if you can get your chief security officer or your chief privacy officer on board, or even have your emerging ethics program live under those organizational structures, you're going to have a ready set team of people who already understand compliance, who already understand data, and who already have some facility with impact assessments, with dealing with stakeholders across the company. So that's one way to do it. You can also put your ethics program in a business unit if you've got a research department or an AI core team at your company. That's also kind of organizationally some place where you can put it. Alec, what do you think about sort of organizational structures in terms of developing an ethics program and what might work as a best practice?
So, I mean, obviously, I agree with everything you said. You made a great case for why these things need to be coordinated. And there's a lot of sort of subject matter expertise and overlap that's going to tend to guide who you're working with and who sort of your natural partners are. Organizational structure, there's a lot of variety. It's hard to say, you can't go in with it belongs here, it's naturally here. We have different governance functions governing data use at Autodesk in different parts of the company. Does it belong next to this one or over here in some independent one? That's really sort of a matter to figure out from experience. I don't think there's a really cut and dry guidance to give on that.
Yeah. And then the other point we want to make is about trust. So, regardless of whether or not the law tells you to do something, you're talking about building and maintaining your trust relationships with your customers and your employees and sort of the larger ecosystem. We've seen a lot of horror stories of, AI gone bad and sort of the things that happened that we don't want to see, and we don't want to have our company in the headlines where something didn't get properly reviewed, or there was a backlash to something, some kind of technology. So you want to really think about this from a trust perspective, as well as just what's required under the law, which, as I said, is coming very soon with the European AI Act, with some of the things that we're seeing in the US and the States, and with the FTC in terms of regulation. Finally, in terms of the service provider role, so those of us that are in companies that are offering tools and services to customers, and we're acting as service providers or processors, if we want to use sort of the GDPR term, think about how you can develop AI ethics programs that are not only going to serve your own company, but also serve the customers who are purchasing or licensing your products. So if you consider that sort of life cycle, and if you're offering your products to an end user, an end customer, how can you make sure that the settings within your products, the notices, the transparency, all of these things, just like when you build, the features and functionality of your products, think about what the perspective is going to be from the customer.
So the only thing I would add to that is the perspective of the people being governed, right? So when you go to create a data ethics program, it's going to have practical impact on the teams who are using data at your company to build new functionality, to build analytics, to build ML of a variety of sorts. And from the perspective of those teams, there's a lot of governance I've got to deal with. And some of it may be privacy, and some of it may be security, resilience. It seems like there are new ones coming up all the time. And here is probably yet another new one, which is ethics. So on top of all of the other reasons to partner with the people who are responsible for the existing types of governance in your company, there is the need that we've taken very seriously in designing our program of trying to actually minimally grow, ideally, ultimately in the long run, even reduce the total overhead, the total burden on the teams doing the work of meeting all of these governance standards. You'll never achieve that if those governance, those different forms of governance are not actively trying to harmonize with one another. So this is something, we've had a data ethics program for a couple of years at Autodesk, and for at least half of that time, we've also been running a working group on governance harmonization specifically to get together and to continue to coordinate on things of this sort. And so there's a lot of things that do need to be harmonized, right? And again, if you keep in mind the perspective of the teams being the individuals and the developers being impacted by your governance, if you keep in mind the fact that they don't need to learn lots of different terminology, right? That's unnecessary overhead. Yes, GDPR has its own special language. Ethics tends to come in with its own special language. But these do not need to get communicated in an unprocessed form as whole new vocabularies, separate vocabularies to the teams doing the work. So the language, agreeing on what it is that we're going to actually be governing here. Are we trying to govern models? Are we trying to govern practices? Are we governing data sets? Even within data itself, data is not a single thing. In some cases, privacy is governing a repository of data, but ML is using only a set of features extracted from that. And the ethics may be interested, the ethics policies may be affecting the features actually consumed by that and not the base data set. So being clear on what it is that you're actually trying to govern. Ideally, going into a single place for the governance so that the process of engaging in governance for these teams doesn't take them to multiple different systems and repositories of information and instructions. So another good reason to join up with the privacy people is chances are they already have a platform that you can leverage, that you can piggyback on to start to do your ethics work as well. Intake processes. Everybody has lots of questions they need to ask in order to understand the situation with a project or with a data set or whatever it is you're trying to govern. Try not to ask those questions over and over again from different governance processes. Ideally, even have a single intake process, or at the very least, if there are multiple points of intake, that those are cross-referenced. So when I come as a user, or let's say a developer or a product manager or something, and I encounter governance in any of its forms, I know that I'm very quickly going to be exposed to all of the complete set of sort of the dance partners I'm going to need to engage with over the course of the reaching total governance or running through the process completely. And then ideally, beyond that, it really becomes a single governance process in the sense that when things are discovered that are problematic or require some form of remediation, that's not then leading the teams off in multiple possible decision makers or multiple possible resources to help with that amelioration, to fix the problem that's there. So governance harmonization is something, and let's go on to the next slide. We also have our much simpler than what we just saw from Salesforce, and I definitely recommend the Salesforce, their life cycle that they were presenting. Lots of rich and valuable data there. But even if you think of it in only very simple terms, sort of a crawl, walk, run model, I would start on the governance harmonization part of it as early as possible. Don't wait to start talking to your peers in these parallel governance processes until you think you know what it is you're doing or you have your program baked and defined. There isn't a time, there isn't a too early point to do this. Even if you're creating, let's say, principles. So this is really talking about how do you operationalize it. It sort of assumes that you've already done the principle work. Well, obviously, for those principles, you're going to want legal involved. You're going to want people involved who have experience with either creating or at least consuming principles that other organizations or other groups have imposed on them. So there's never too early a time to get going with the harmonization.
I'll just add a couple of thoughts on the governance harmonization. I think it's really important to get your adoption of a new thought process if you're making it easy for the end user. So if, like Alex said, you're a product manager or your team that wants to do XYZ with data, if they have to jump over 10 different hoops to get something done, or they have to wait, or they have to go to 5 different committees, they're not going to come back. They're either going to go off and do their own thing and not get the proper kind of governance approvals that, right, they're going to go do their shadow IT potentially, or you're just going to have sort of a bad feeling and legal is going to be the bad guy, or the governance is going to be the bad thing that everyone's, imposing on you. And instead of it being a collaboration where the governance and compliance roles are here to enable what the business wants to do, and we're trying to find the easiest path forward for you to do that. So a lot of what we've been trying to find are those sort of fast tracks for business teams to be able to get what they need done as quickly and as easily as possible without a lot of legal oversight. And that depends on what kind of data they're using and what are those use cases. So if they're using de-identified data and they're doing things that are very low risk, we can put them on a path that's much less of sort of infrastructure or governance oversight, because we've already kind of predetermined that that's low risk. And then we can say, hey, if you want to do something else, here's the very clear path for you to take. Here's the harmonized intake process. Here's the committees you need to go talk to. Here's some trainings. Here's a playbook. Here's some guidance that's going to actually help you. Not only from a compliance perspective, but also from an AI enablement perspective. So we partner very closely with a team at Autodesk that's actually helping get these AI projects off the ground. So nothing to do with compliance, really, just like helping teams understand how to access data, how to run these algorithms in the most effective way, best practices, use cases, sort of a coach on the AI enablement side. So we're partnering with them, and there is that sort of through line between the governance compliance side and the enablement, but we're all working together, and the message that we want to send to the business teams is, this is how we enable trust, this is how we enable responsible AI, and this is baked into our culture. It's not the sort of check the box exercise, and we're not trying to make your life difficult. We're really trying to help enable the business initiatives.
Yeah, I mean, put it even more stark terms, it's a big mistake in a governance function to ever assume that you're required. Even if the law says you are, even if the C staff has said that thou shalt or whatever, the fact is teams reject governance all the time. Companies reject governance. Whole industries reject governance. So you should always be approaching this with how can I get this thing adopted by the teams that I think will benefit, and how can I make it clear that they will benefit from the governance that I'm bringing to them.
Right, and how is there value in what you're offering? So the value that we offer to our customers, the value that the governance, harmonization, or our AI ethics program offers to the company. It's the value add that we lead with, and then we sort of sprinkle in all the compliance things that people have to do.
Yeah. Questions? That's all we have.